I am recording this in case I don't make it back. At least there will be some record. Maybe you will have a chance. My name is David, and I've been working as a detective for 12 years. I'm good at my job. I even have a 95% clearance rate. That means that I've solved over 90% of my cases. The national average is 43. My nickname at the department is the Preacher. Funny, 'cause I don't even believe. Before my father died, though, he gave me the cross he always wore and made me promise I would never take it off. Any other time, I would have argued with him. Whenever I look in the mirror and see it, I tuck it away under my shirt. It always seems out of place, like it doesn't belong. I mention it because of what happened last Thursday. Thursday night, a case was reassigned to me. A woman had been found dead in the basement of an abandoned church. Her body had already been taken to the coroner, so I made myself a cup of coffee and grabbed my jacket on the way out the door. While I waited for the coroner to return, I examined the dead woman. Slowly moving around the table, I saw no obvious cause of death. Pretty, 20s, blonde, no blood under the fingernails, no signs of struggle. Nothing. So I walked over to one of the metal chairs, sat down, and waited for him to return. I closed my eyes for a moment, giving them a rest from the harsh glare of the overhead lights. When I glanced back at her, that's when I saw 2 marks on her neck. How had I missed them? I walked to her side, not taking my eyes from the 2 marks on her throat. But as I leaned down to examine her, I found myself looking at nothing. There was nothing there. I thought of the scene of the homicide, an old abandoned church on Canal Road. A homeless man had been sleeping in the choir loft when he heard a woman screaming, so he ran outside and eventually flagged down a passing police car. They found her on the stone floor of the church basement. I watched the sun go down as I drove over to the scene of the church, where the woman had been killed the day before. All the other officers had left, and I was alone, in the quiet. Pushing open the large oak doors of the church, I stared up at the altar. It had been many years since the place had been abandoned. Maybe it was the cold, stone face of the statue staring down at me, but I began to feel uneasy. I pulled myself together and headed down the stairway at the back of the church. It was pitch black, and as my flashlight flickered, I cursed myself for not bringing an extra one. I made my way down the circular stone stairway and found myself in front of a heavy oak door. A large carving of a cross had been scratched out. Pushing the oak door open slowly and with some effort, I peered into the darkness of the basement. Ducking under the caution tape, I saw an old candle and a set of matches nearby. Striking a match, I lit the candle and illuminated the room before me. Although the body had been removed, I could still feel a sense of death around me. Kneeling down to examine the chalk outline on the ground before me, I put my hand where her body had been and closed my eyes, trying to picture her last moments. Something dark flashed inside my mind, and I got this feeling like something lives here and maybe it's coming back. Pushing those thoughts out of my mind, I examined the room carefully and found two things of importance. The first, a silver cross, like the one my father had given me, on the ground of the basement. While a cross in a church is nothing out of the ordinary, this one was different. Its surface was burnt, charred, like it had been set on fire and just left to burn. I picked it up carefully and bagged it as evidence. Using the candle to light my way, I came across something else out of place. A word scribbled on the wall, barely even visible in the darkness. I wrote the letters into my notebook. Utarevson. Later that night, back at home, I sat in front of my desk and stared at the burnt cross. Opening up the notebook, I tried to make sense of the letters on the wall. Maybe it had been there for years. Utarevson. As I stared out my kitchen window into the darkness of the forest, it occurred to me that maybe the letters were mixed up somehow. Moving the letters around for a few minutes, I realized I had neglected to do the most obvious thing. Maybe the word was backwards. As I wrote the word out, my excitement was gone as quickly as it had come. A sense of dread came over me as I looked down at my notebook. Nosferatu. This will be the end of my recording for tonight. I'm going back to the church. I have to. There has to be some explanation. God, I hope I'm wrong. If I make it back, I will record another update. But if I don't, maybe you will be able to pick up where I left off. Nosferatu. Nosferatu. An old man and his dog stand together looking across the open water. They live in a small coastal town in Alaska. The news reported that the old man's son had drowned while they were out fishing. It was a fluke accident, the reporter had said. There was nothing more anyone could do. The old man and the dog glanced at each other, then back at the water. They knew better. It had been a dark, foggy night as the old man and his son Thomas had been out fishing. They always brought their dog Crichton, who loved to be out on the boat. The two men were enjoying a beer when the dog started to growl. "What is it, boy?" Thomas asked. In an instant, something huge had latched onto Thomas's arm. He fell back into the water. His father jumped in after him to no avail. The dog and the old man were forced to watch as the dark thing took his son, pulling him down deep into the water. That had been 1 week ago. An accident? No. Though it was dark, the man had made out two distinct yellow eyes. He swore the thing had smiled back at him as it pulled his son farther and farther into the darkness. A week later, having hardly left his home, the old man filled up the dog's food and water bowls on the porch. He locked the front door of his little house and put the key in the mail. Walking down to the dock, the old man was lost in thought. He held back tears as he knew he would never see his son again. He would never get to talk with him, never hear him laugh. The monster had taken all that away. Boarding the 30-foot sailboat, the dog quickly jumped on before the old man could push the boat off from shore. "Where do you think you're going?" The dog looked back up at him and towards the open water. "I don't think we're gonna make it back, boy." Seeing what looked like determination in the dog's eyes, the old man nodded. The dog had left his son too. Armed only with an old spear gun and a knife his son had given him, he had decided to kill whatever had taken Thomas. They motored into the night, 1 week exactly from the day his son had died. Same time of night, same foggy conditions. "I figure it was sometime around midnight," the old man said, turning the old wooden wheel of the boat and scanning the fog. "Maybe it hunts at midnight." The dog stood silently near the wheel, not leaving the old man's side. It wasn't until 2 a.m. that the creature finally showed itself. It peeked its head up from under the water. Though it was 100 yards out, 2 large yellow eyes stood out in the darkness of the water. The dog growled fiercely as the old man grabbed the spear gun and stared at the creature. They locked eyes. The monster slowly moved farther out, not in fear, but beckoning the old man and the dog to follow. And they did. It led them out miles from shore into the beginnings of a storm. Watching Crichton pace back and forth, the old man watched the creature in the water ahead of them. "I know what it's doing, boy. It don't matter. We ain't coming back, but that thing ain't either. We're gonna kill it. For Thomas." As the sailboat was now fully in the storm, the hull shook violently with each new wave. The two of them took cover below and kept watch through the small windows as they waited. Suddenly, the monster appeared. It broke the glass of the window and slashed its claws into the flesh of the old man's shoulder. The spear gun dropped from his hands and slid across the floor. Barking furiously, the dog lunged at the monster and bit down. Screaming in pain, the thing leapt away from the shattered window. They could hear it moving around them to the other side of the boat. Dark red blood poured from the man's shoulder. "I'm all right. Let's kill it, boy." He grabbed the spear gun and opened the hatch as they went outside cautiously into the storm. The rain was blinding, and they could barely see. "Where is it, boy?" Seeing something rush towards him, the old man fired the gun quickly and struck the monster. Even at 72, he was a hell of a shot. As he bent down to reload the gun, the creature came at him again. It hit the old man full force in the chest, knocking him back and sinking its razor-sharp teeth into him again and again. Then a scream of surprise and rage echoed through the downpour. The creature felt the strong jaws of the dog lock on the back of its neck. Its claws flailed wildly, raking the dog's side. But the dog never faltered. He stood with his paws on the thing's back and bit down hard. There was a snapping sound, and the creature lay still. But its eyes were still aware, and as it lay, unable to move, it watched the old man and the dog with a rage and pure hatred. "You shouldn't have taken my son." Staring back at the monster, the old man found the handle of his knife and plunged it deep into the creature's skull. With a shudder, its raspy breath stopped. It was finally dead. They had killed it. Sitting back down to rest for a moment, the old man struggled to stand. He dragged the creature's limp carcass to the back of the boat, pulled it up and over the side, and let it go. The old man and the dog watched as it slid, lifeless, into the sea. As the two of them sat together on the boat one last time, the old man rested his hand on the dog's head. "Good boy." He pulled out his flare gun and shot it once, far into the sky. "I'm sorry, boy. You stay here. Though the sky was beginning to clear, the lingering wind still shook the boat from side to side. The dog watched as the old man closed his eyes. His head fell through his chest, and he slid peacefully into the sea. Almost jumping in after him, the dog quietly whined and paced back and forth. The old man had told him to stay. Sometime later, the Coast Guard pulled up next to the boat. They found only a large German Shepherd, covered in blood, looking down into the water. And that's how it came to be, that an old man and a dog killed a monster.
The wind howled like a banshee, a wild beast clawing at the mountainside. Snow, thick and relentless, whipped through the air, obscuring everything in a whiteout. It was the kind of storm that chilled you to the bone, even inside the relative safety of a moving vehicle. The old Jeep struggled forward, its headlights cutting through the swirling snow like feeble knives. Inside, 4 figures huddled together for warmth, their faces etched with worry. There was Sarah, the level-headed doctor, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Beside her sat Mark, a rugged outdoorsman, his eyes scanning the treacherous road ahead. In the back sat Emily, a young artist, her face pale with fear, and David, a cynical writer, his hand never far from the flask of whiskey he kept tucked in his coat pocket. They had been driving for hours, hoping to reach the small town on the other side of the mountain pass. But the storm, unexpected and brutal, had caught them off guard. Now lost and with night closing in, their situation was growing desperate. "We need to find shelter," Sarah said, her voice barely audible above the roar of the wind. "We can't survive the night out here." Mark nodded grimly, his eyes searching the roadside. "There has to be something. A cabin, an overhang, anything." Just as despair began to set in, a faint light appeared through the driving snow, a flicker of yellow, weak but steady like a beacon in the storm. The cabin stood at the edge of a clearing, its silhouette barely discernible through the swirling snowflakes. The forest around it seemed to close in, as if guarding the secrets held within its wooden walls. Dark and imposing against the backdrop of the raging storm, the cabin seemed almost otherworldly. The wind howled through the trees, creating an eerie symphony that sent shivers down the spine. It looked ancient, almost swallowed by the snowdrifts that piled up against its walls. The weight of countless winters had left their mark, giving the structure an air of timelessness and mystery. A rickety wooden sign, barely visible under a thick layer of ice, proclaimed it to be Pinewood Cabin. The letters were faded but still legible, hinting at a history long forgotten. Hope surged through the weary travelers as Mark pulled the Jeep to a stop beside the cabin. The journey had been long and treacherous, and the sight of shelter brought a glimmer of relief to their tired eyes. It wasn't much, but it offered shelter from the deadly cold. The cabin stood as a beacon of hope amidst the relentless storm, a promise of warmth and safety. David, ever the cynic, grunted his skepticism. His eyes scanned the cabin warily, as if expecting it to vanish into thin air. "Looks like something out of a horror movie," he muttered, taking a swig from his flask. The unease in his voice was palpable, a stark contrast to the hope that had momentarily lifted their spirits. Ignoring him, Sarah and Mark approached the cabin, their boots crunching on the fresh snow. Each step brought them closer to the promise of warmth, a reprieve from the biting cold. The wooden door creaked open with a groan, revealing a dark and dusty interior. The air inside was thick with the scent of decay, mingling with the musty smell of old wood. The cabin was small, consisting of a single room dominated by a large stone fireplace. The hearth, though cold and empty, seemed to beckon them to light a fire and chase away the shadows. A rough-hewn table and chairs sat in the center, and a set of narrow bunks lined one wall. The furniture, though simple, spoke of a time when the cabin had been a refuge for weary souls. The air was stale and heavy, thick with the scent of decay and something else, something vaguely unsettling. It was as if the cabin held memories of those who had sought shelter within its walls. "Hello?" Sarah called out, her voice echoing in the silence. The sound seemed to linger, amplifying the emptiness of the space. There was no reply, only the mournful howl of the wind outside. It was a reminder of the storm that raged beyond the fragile walls of their sanctuary. Despite the unsettling atmosphere, the travelers were grateful for the refuge. The cabin, eerie as it was, offered a chance to rest and regroup. They quickly set about making a fire, the warmth of the flames pushing back the chill that had seeped into their bones. The flickering light brought a semblance of normalcy to the otherwise eerie setting. As the fire crackled and hissed, casting flickering shadows across the cabin walls, they began to feel a sense of relief, a momentary reprieve from the deadly storm outside. The warmth wrapped around them like a comforting blanket, offering solace in the midst of chaos. As the storm raged outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the rain battered against the windows of the old cabin. Thunder roared in the distance, shaking the very foundation of the small wooden structure. Emily stumbled upon an old leather-bound journal, its cover worn and cracked from years of neglect. It was tucked beneath a pile of dusty blankets, hidden away as if it held secrets too dark to be revealed. Its pages were yellowed with age, each one fragile and delicate to the touch. The ink had faded but was still legible, telling a story that had been forgotten by time. "Look at this," she said, her voice hushed with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Her eyes scanned the first few lines, and she felt a chill run down her spine. The travelers gathered around the table, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight. Each one was drawn to the journal as if it held a magnetic pull. The flickering firelight cast eerie shadows on the journal's aged pages, making the words dance and come alive. David, his usual cynicism momentarily forgotten, leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make out the faded script. His eyes scanned the faded script, each word pulling him deeper into the past. The journal belonged to a man named Jedediah, a trapper who had sought shelter in the cabin over a century ago. His entries were filled with tales of the mountain, its unforgiving winters, and the strange occurrences that plagued him during his time in the cabin. The harsh winters were described in vivid detail, the cold seeping into his bones and the howling winds keeping him awake at night. And then there were the strange occurrences, the eerie sounds that echoed through the cabin, and the feeling of being watched. As David read aloud, his voice taking on a somber tone, the entries grew increasingly disturbing. Jedediah wrote of strange noises, whispers in the dead of night, and a growing sense of dread that permeated the cabin. The more he read, the more the sense of unease grew among the group. Each entry seemed to be a descent into madness, a chronicle of a man haunted by unseen forces. Jedediah wrote of strange noises, whispers in the dead of night, and a growing sense of dread that permeated the cabin. The whispers seemed to come from the very walls, as if the cabin itself was alive and aware of their presence. And with each passing night, the sense of dread grew stronger, wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud. "He says there's a presence here," David said, his voice barely a whisper. "A malevolent spirit trapped within these walls," Mark scoffed, shaking his head. "Ghost stories to scare children," he muttered. "Don't tell me you believe this nonsense." But there was a tension in the air, a palpable fear that none of them could shake. Even Mark, with his skepticism, couldn't completely dismiss the unease that had settled over the group. Sarah noticed the tremor in David's hand as he closed the journal, his knuckles white against the worn leather. She could see the fear in his eyes, a fear that mirrored her own. His knuckles were white against the worn leather, gripping the journal as if it were a lifeline. Jedediah's final entry, scrawled in a shaky hand, sent a chill down her spine. "It knows my name," Jedediah had written. "It's coming for me, and it won't rest until it claims the souls of all who enter this cursed place." The words seemed to echo in the silence of the cabin, a haunting reminder of the past that refused to be forgotten. Outside, the storm continued to rage, as if nature itself was warning them of the danger that lurked within the cabin's walls. The travelers exchanged uneasy glances, each one wondering if they too would fall victim to the whispers from the past. The storm raged on, a symphony of wind and snow, a relentless force of nature that seemed to have no end. The howling wind and swirling snowflakes created an almost surreal atmosphere, as if the world outside the cabin had been transformed into a frozen wasteland. That seemed to isolate the cabin from the rest of the world. Despite the warmth of the fire, a sense of unease settled over the travelers. Jedediah's words, filled with fear and desperation, hung heavy in the air. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls, but it did little to dispel the growing tension among the group. David, his cynicism replaced by a growing fear, paced the confines of the cabin, taking long swigs from his flask. His usual bravado had vanished, replaced by a palpable anxiety that gnawed at him. He muttered to himself, his eyes darting to the windows as if expecting some unseen horror to burst through at any moment. Emily huddled near the fire, her eyes wide with apprehension, her hands trembling as she clutched a blanket around her shoulders. She tried to draw comfort from the warmth, but the fear in her heart was like ice, cold and unyielding. While Sarah tried to maintain a semblance of calm, her medical training urging her to focus on the rationale. She took deep breaths, reminding herself to stay composed, but even she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Her mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Only Mark seemed unaffected by the journal's revelations. He dismissed it as the ramblings of a madman, but even his usually steady voice held a slight tremor, betraying his outward composure. He tried to rationalize the situation, but the unease in his eyes betrayed his true feelings. As night deepened, the storm reached its peak, the wind howling like a tormented beast. The cabin creaked and groaned under the relentless assault, and the travelers huddled closer together, their fear palpable. It was then that it happened. A sudden gust of wind slammed against the cabin, momentarily extinguishing the fire and plunging them into darkness. The sudden loss of light was disorienting, and for a moment all they could hear was the howling wind and their own panicked breaths. In the chaos that followed, a terrifying scream pierced the night. It was David's voice, filled with a raw terror that sent shivers down their spines. The scream was abruptly cut off, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Struggling to relight the fire, Sarah and Mark found David slumped against the wall, his eyes wide with fear, his body trembling. The flickering light revealed the horror of his condition, and they could see the terror etched into his features. His throat ripped open in a grotesque mockery of a smile. Blood stained his clothes and the wooden floor beneath him, a gruesome testament to the unseen force that had claimed him. The sight was almost too much to bear, and they recoiled in horror. Emily, her face white with terror, could only stare at the scene before her, her mind struggling to comprehend the horror that had unfolded in the space of a heartbeat. The reality of their situation began to sink in, and the true extent of the danger they faced became horrifyingly clear.